Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 19th of November, 2024, and coming to you here with something of a special edition, which is an interview that I recorded earlier today with comrade Iskolat. That's the comrade's name on Twitter or X. And this interview is of great interest. I'm sure it'll be of great interest to you. There is a reason why it's presented in the particular format that it is, which is that it was an audio-only interview. And it had to be an audio-only interview because of the conditions which prevail in not just Latvia, but also Lithuania and Estonia, and conditions that prevail, of course, in a number of other former Soviet states, which is that communist activity and organization is systematically suppressed on the entirely bogus charges of being pro-Russian, whatever that means, and those such as this particular comrade's, those who have this particular comrade's beliefs are subjected to state repression. And this, of course, is never mentioned in the supposedly free press of Britain or the United States. The fact that the Baltic states are held out as models of freedom is in fact obviously a total lie. They are models of comprador states, as the interview makes clear. They are the direct descendants of the petty comprador, semi-fascist and outright fascist regimes that existed in Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia between the breakout of the Bolshevik Revolution and the return of the socialist cause in the 1930s. And the comrade makes a lot of very interesting points in this interview, including about the revolution that broke out in Latvia in 1917 and the strength and determination of the Latvian communists in waging a long struggle against the local comprador regimes and the local fascists that was ultimately successful twice over. And this interview, we cover the first part of this struggle, which is the struggle against the comprador regime, and which ultimately ends in a triumphant moment, which is the overthrow of the fascist dictatorship and the successful vote by the Latvians, Lithuanians and Estonians, in this case we're talking mainly about Latvia, to join the USSR as a constituent republic. Now, if you're at all familiar with the way that bourgeois history deals with the Baltic states, none of this will be at all familiar to you, because the way we're presented with the history of the Baltic states is that the evil Stalin staged an invasion in 1940 because he felt like it, and this was resisted by the entire Latvian, Lithuanian and Estonian nations. This is a complete lie. What you will see from this interview is that in Latvia there was a revolutionary proletariat which struggled in 1917 to establish socialism and was unfortunately defeated, that struggled again to do so in the 1930s and ultimately triumphed in that struggle. And the joining of Latvia to the USSR as a constituent republic was something that was a demand of the Latvian working class and peasantry, who overthrew a fascist dictatorship in order to get to that point. And this is a struggle which has been systematically erased by the Latvian compradors and fascists and by their masters in Washington and London. And what we see here with regard to the Baltic states is how an entire history of class struggle, an entire history of struggle against the worst kinds of comprador regime has been erased following the counter-revolutions that took place between 1989 and 1991. So be sure to take in all the interesting parts of this interview. There is a reading list which goes along with this interview, which is pasted up on the Telegram channel, on my Telegram channel. You can go and find it on there. And I urge you to come back for part 2 of this interview, which will be recorded in a few days, where we will deal with Latvia in the war resistance to the Nazis, and the building of socialism after the war. And so, without further ado, I will throw you over to the interview, and I'll return to you when the interview is done in just over an hour or so. So here's the interview with myself and Comrade Iskolat. We are here today to conduct what I think will be a very interesting discussion with Comrade Iskolat, who some of you who are regular viewers and listeners to this program might be familiar with from Twitter or X, depending upon which particular piece of terminology for Elon Musk's platform you want to use. He is a communist from Latvia who has been very active on Twitter over the recent years, putting out very valuable true histories of the socialist period in Latvian history, which is something which those of us who grew up in the imperialist countries will be wholly unfamiliar with. I went through an entire university course on what was laughably called Soviet history, and none of this was ever brought up. So I'm very happy to welcome you to the program today, Comrade. And would you like to start out by introducing yourself?
Thank you. As you already told the audience, we represent a group of communists from Latvia. We have contacts with a lot of our comrades from Russia, from the United States, from Canada, and other places in Europe. We're trying to be active everywhere, in as many places as possible. So we're already trying to expand our audience to Facebook. Obviously, we're also active on places like Twitter, Reddit, and we're also thinking about expanding to some other lesser known social media platforms like Blue Sky and the like. And you can almost certainly find us by simply searching up Baltic SSRs, and you can find a lot of valuable insight, book links, including English language sources, and a lot of other people that we work with. So well, before 2020, yeah.
Thank you for that. And just to say, you have provided us with numerous links to English language sources, so we will be putting those in the show description. And I encourage everybody listening to this to go and read through as many of those English language sources as possible, because again, this won't be anything that you will have seen in any bourgeois history of this period, or from any of the supposedly Marxist groups that dominate the leftist political scene in Britain and America. So I encourage you to read as widely as possible from the sources that the Comrade today has very graciously provided to us.
And before we tackle the topics proper about the history of interwar Latvia and the Baltics, I would like to add some important contemporary information about the repression that the communist and all progressive groups are facing now in former Soviet countries and Eastern Europe. Because first of all, this is very important information, because we should always help each other and to spread the word about the hardships that people here face. And of course, when we will study the interwar history, you will see a lot of parallels and a lot of brutal things that happened back then. They are repeated by the bourgeoisie today. So before 2022, we were in legal groups like the Workers' Front of Latvia, but after 2022, because of our pro-worker activity and resistance against fascization of the Baltics, our groups were banned by the secret services, and we have to be completely underground, unfortunately. And similar things are happening in Ukraine and also in Russia, where the communists and union organizers are being ostracized, imprisoned, and wrongfully convicted. You've certainly heard about the Kononovich brothers, the Ukrainian communist youth that are getting falsely imprisoned with bogus charges. There's also the Russian labor organizer Anatoly Bannych at the Ural Motors, who was arrested recently for organizing a workers' strikes. For example, the communist organizers in Russia, headed by Alexei Dmitriev. And right now, the bourgeoisie is going all out. It is repressing not only the communists now, but virtually all opposition groups that pose even the slightest threat. And right now, in the UK, in Ukraine, in Poland, in the Baltics, and Russia, they're even repressing some right-wing opposition leaders. This is very interesting because this means that the bourgeoisie is rapidly losing all traces of or any semblance of popular support that it has, and it has to repress absolutely everyone just to cling to power. And I also have to mention the tragic events in Ukraine and Russia. For example, the horrific murder of Comrade Texas, Russell Bentley, and many other such instances. We also have a lot of comrades in Russia who are reporting that the bourgeoisie are using brown shirt-like formations to carry out extrajudicial beatings and murders. For example, two comrades from Moscow who helped the refugees from Kursk, they were killed. And for example, our comrade that we work with closely, Comrade Ruslan, he's getting attacked all the time, for example, by the nationalist groups, by the brown shirts, and we can see these trends everywhere in Europe and in North America. For example, in Ohio, there was a huge neo-Nazi gathering, and obviously the capitalist law enforcement didn't do anything because it's their groups. We call them the financed right. So they're now openly financing these groups because they don't have any popular footing. So they have to resort to these brown shirts. They have to arrest a lot of people. So they're going after everyone now. For example, they're going after Trotsky's groups in Russia. They're going even after opportunists. Uh, this is this shows just how deep in the crisis capitalism is. So, for example, other activists such as Udaltsov, Myamlin, and other labor organizers and labor union leaders are getting arrested everywhere in Eastern Europe. And it shows that Eastern Europe is now critical because if imperialism loses Eastern Europe, then it's game over for them. That is why they're trying to spark as many conflicts as they can, and that's why they're trying to keep the Ukraine thing going as long as they can. So this was my foreword, and so we'll tackle the interwar history of the Baltics and Eastern Europe in general.
Yes, if we can start there, because I think, as you correctly point out, we will see a lot of similarities, or at least some some common themes which are present in both periods in history. So I'd like to start off the discussion by asking you to talk a little bit about the impact of the October Revolution in Latvia and the other Baltic states, perhaps as well, in late 1917, because I gather from what I've read that the October Revolution did cause an outbreak of revolutionary action and the establishment briefly of Soviet power in Latvia, but this was crushed by counter-revolutionary forces assisted by the Western imperialist powers. Is that correct?
Yes, totally. And Latvia had several Soviet governments at various points in time. The first one being the Iskolat Republic, which was formed just 3 weeks after the November, or shall I say October Revolution, because Russia back then still used the old style. So at the start of December, the first revolutionary committees and Soviets sprung up in Latvia, the areas that were free of German occupation on the right bank of the Daugava River. And on December 21st, the Iskolat Republic was established in a small town of Valka. Right now, it is located in Estonia, and the eponymous Iskolat house is still there. It's a large building where all of the councils and Soviets of northern Latvia and southern Estonia gathered, and they proclaimed that the dictatorship of the proletariat is to be established. But unfortunately, soon after that, the Germans overran the entirety of the Baltics because the Trotskyists, they stalled negotiations, and because of that, the Germans refused to settle for their existing occupation, and they conquered all of the Baltics, all of Belarus, and all of Ukraine, as per the finalized Brest-Litovsk Treaty. So the Latvians had to retreat to Soviet Russia, and many of them had to stay underground in order to keep in touch. And both the Latvian bourgeoisie and the German imperialists started carrying out horrific repressions against anyone who even remotely supported the social democrat, the socialist, the communist cause.
Yes, and this, just to emphasize the point, the repression carried out by what are termed to be like the White Russian forces, the counter-revolutionary forces between 1917 and 1921, consist of a plethora of horrific massacres of communists and those accused of being communists, all the way across what became the Soviet Union, and the revolution had to hold out against a series of foreign interventions, which really did try to drown the entire thing in blood. And central to this were the conspiracies and the active intervention of the British government, which played a leading role in trying to destroy Soviet power. And that is, again, a part of British history which comes immediately after the First World War. And again, this is never talked about in the British education system at all. The fact that the British were behind so much of the savage counter-revolutionary violence, or at least that they were backing it very heavily, never talked about. And as you said, the fact that there were revolutions in the Baltic states and these were crushed, that is not talked about either by Western historians or the Latvian, Lithuanian, and Estonian reactionaries who came to power in that interwar period. And nor do their modern equivalents want to talk about this either, because if you believed the stories that the Latvian, Lithuanian, and Estonian anti-communists and reactionaries tell, the Soviet Union invaded these countries in 1939 to 40 and arbitrarily established a tyrannical regime, whereas in actual fact, the real story is that the Latvian, Lithuanian, and Estonian workers and peasants fought for over 20 years against these comprador regimes that were stooges of imperialism, and fought to actually restore the revolution that had been crushed in that period immediately after 1917.
Yes, that is absolutely correct. I went through the school system under capitalism, and that is entirely correct. All of this information, all of this context, all of these incredibly important details are omitted. Basically, this whole Civil War period between 1917 and 1920, it is almost entirely omitted. It is basically a footnote. While in the Soviet sources, this period it is worth textbooks, worth of information, giant doorstopper books, thousands and thousands of pages of witness testimony, of all these official documents, of all these orders, of economical statistics, etc., etc. And the Baltics were at the forefront of the revolution, together with the workers of Moscow and Petrograd, because we must not forget that the Baltics overall were incredibly industrialized, and Riga was one of the top cities in the Russian Empire when we're talking about capital accumulation and the capitalist expansion, because it was the fourth or the fifth biggest city in Russia, and that is very important because it was similar to cities such as Moscow, St. Petersburg, Baku, Kiev, and Warsaw. And obviously, because of that rapid political and economic development, soon the whole region was incredibly communist. And if you look at the statistics of labor strikes, labor disputes, and revolutionary struggle, for example, in the revolution of 1905, that you can see that these areas were all extremely red. They were dark red. So the strikes were everywhere. The revolutionary action was everywhere. So obviously, for imperialism, it was vital to crush these areas, to subjugate these areas, and use the Baltics as a springboard for further expansion. So to get back to the historical timeline, in November of 1918, November 11th, the German Empire imploded. The massive strike action and the massive disruptions of their wartime economy by the social democratic groups, by the communist groups, they led to the destruction of the monarchy. And the German Republic was established. But at the same time, the German imperialist circles did not want to evacuate the Baltics because they knew that they would have to surrender it. But at the same time, they wanted to prevent the communist revolution. So the German barons and the German social chauvinist government of Scheidemann, they conspired with the Entente powers, namely with the United Kingdom and France, to try to stay there for as long as possible. And instead of the official German army, they wanted to raise these so-called militia and iron division groups that consisted of all kinds of mercenaries and die-hard believers and German imperial dominance. And on the November 18th, the Latvian bourgeoisie and the kulaks, they established their own bourgeois republic with the express approval of the German command in the Baltics, headed by August Winnig. He gave them the go-ahead because what the communists called this was colonialism under the national flag. So on paper, we have these sovereign nations, but in reality, all of their leaders are essentially handpicked. All of their economy is subsidized and controlled by foreign capitalist powers. And their military might is also bought and paid for by the imperialists. And both the German and the Entente observers, they noted that the bourgeois government of Latvia, headed by Kārlis Ulmanis, it was deeply unpopular, and the government was completely incompetent at anything. So basically, imperialists had to bail them out time after time. And soon, in December, the Latvian communists, as a response, had to declare their own Soviet republic, the Latvian Socialist Soviet Republic, the first one that was established in December and January of 1919. And soon, the Soviet Republic overran the bourgeois positions, and the capitalist government only controlled the extreme southwest of the country, and it was protected by the British warships and the German divisions. So the Soviet government could not progress any further because it was already exhausted. The country was war torn. We lost almost half of our population. Almost all of the major industrial centers were destroyed, and the country needed to rebuild itself. And the imperialists used that reprieve in order to mount a crushing offensive because they managed to gather a lot of financial resources. Mainly, the United States gave the Ulmanis government over $5 million. That was a lot of money back then. And the British Empire gave 1.3 million pounds sterling. And in total, more than 80,000 mercenaries were assembled from Germany, from Sweden, from Denmark, from Poland, from Lithuania, and also the White Estonian government from the north. After crushing the Estonian labor commune, they launched their own offensive from the north, and the White Poles and the White Lithuanians launched their offensive from the south. So it was a major pincer attack that the Soviet government just could not repel because at their peak, the Soviet Latvians had only 40,000 men. And like I told you, the country was completely torn to shreds because of the imperialist war. And the Latvian riflemen, they fought in Latvia too against the imperialists, but they were called elsewhere because in the Far East there was a major crisis. In the Caucasus there was a major crisis. The Soviet Republic was faced with intervention from all fronts, and the Soviet authorities made a very painful decision to eventually leave Latvia because there was just too much pressure, and there was a choice. Either we stand our ground and perish, or we gather whatever we can. We sacrifice some things, but we save the Soviet government in Moscow. We save Soviet Russia. So that was the decision that had to be made. And the white forces, they massacred every town they entered. And the most infamous example is the rape of Riga, which occurred on May 22nd, 1919, where more than 5,000 men, women, and children were savagely murdered. And anyone, even remotely accused of being a sympathizer of the Communist Party, of labor unions, they were all slaughtered and left in the streets. And the bodies, you were forbidden from picking up the bodies and giving them a proper burial under the threat of executions. So the German white forces, the Latvian white forces, they just reveled in this horrific violence. And in smaller towns, they killed people by the thousands. For example, in the small industrial town of Valmiera, they went as far as executing children en masse. For example, the entire Komsomol organization in Valmiera was slaughtered, and the children were as young as 12 years old when that happened. And in total, more than 15,000 people in Latvia were brutally killed, just like they were killed in Estonia, in Finland, in Lithuania, and Poland. And when people talk about the Jakarta method, the Indonesia genocide, where millions of communists were murdered, this recipe, this imperialist solution was invented in the Baltics, where they started just mass murdering everybody in an attempt to crush communism. And by early 2020, the communists evacuated the easternmost part of Latvia in order to sign a peace with the counter-revolutionary forces as soon as possible, because there were crises in the Caucasus and the Far East, and the Soviet government needed to conclude peace as soon as possible to prevent further imperialist enroachment. The Communist Party of Latvia was immediately banned. Many communists had to go to Soviet Russia just to survive, but many people stayed behind. They went underground in order to maintain contacts, to maintain this vital link between the Communist Party and the working class in Latvia. And that's when the interwar story begins, after the peace treaty of Riga that was signed between the Soviet government and the White Poland and the White Baltics.
Well, just to come in on the point about the ferocity and the bloodthirstiness of the repression there, a lot of this comes straight from the rather brutal practices of the imperialist countries themselves. This is how the British always responded to risings against their rule in the countries that they occupied, including in Ireland. It's how the French responded as well. It's how the Germans themselves behaved in the countries like what's now called Namibia. This is how imperialism acts whenever it is challenged, even in a small way. It's just mass killing. It takes on a greater degree of ferocity and hysteria on the part of the imperialists when it's communists challenging them. But what you just described there, those mass murders in Latvia in 1919 and 1920, that very much reminds me of the way that the Nazis ultimately act in the east of Europe and the occupied Soviet countries in what's known as either World War II or the Great Patriotic War. And it's very similar. I mean, for the Nazis, it was on an even bigger scale, but it wasn't something they invented. This was done by their predecessors in the form of the German imperialists and the British aligned forces much earlier, 20 years earlier. So there's nothing the only thing that's unique about the Nazis and the way they behaved really is the scale on which they did it. But they didn't invent these horrific methods that they used. This had already been done to subjugated countries and to communists for many years before, hadn't it?
Yes, that is correct. And this history of brutality waged by imperialism, not only capitalist imperialism, but also feudal imperialism,
Yes.
It traces back a lot earlier because, as the communists noted, this sheer brutality is that it was waged by the social chauvinist forces by the German colonists and then by the Nazis, it is basically it is the ugliest face of Prussian militarism and Junkerism. So the Junkers were these huge militaristic landowners in Brandenburg and Prussia, and this sort of imperialism that is waged by the Crusaders, by the German feudal lords against the Baltics. It started in the 12th century during the Northern Crusades, where they invaded the region of Prussia that was inhabited by the Baltic tribe that was also called the Prussians. So what they did, they completely exterminated this third largest Baltic tribe. So the Baltic peoples, they consist of Latvians and Latgalians, the Lithuanians and the Prussians. So the Prussians were subjugated and conquered first. And by the early 18th century, they were completely eradicated. All of their cultural heritage, their language, many of them were slaughtered, and the rest were forced to Germanize. Some of them managed to flee to Poland and Lithuania, where they assimilated because they were all scattered and defeated. And this imperialist brutality was the continuation of this crusader policy that the German imperialists viewed the Baltics or Terra Mariana, as they referred to it, as the pure German soil that must be conquered and colonized and settled exclusively by Germans. And the locals would be nothing more than serfs that would simply tirelessly work for the German economic might.
Yes, this is, of course, the legacy which Adolf Hitler and the Nazi leaders very specifically wanted to tap into and to recreate in their own time. And indeed, they did to a horrific extent. Just to move to the question of the interwar years and the bourgeois regimes that existed in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. These, having read some of the material you shared with me earlier, it seems that the regimes that were set up, as you were indicating in your previous answer, were what would best be described as neo-colonial regimes, with nominal independence, but in reality completely dominated by imperialism. And so what was created there were countries that were deliberately underdeveloped, where any industry that didn't provide a fast return to imperialist so-called investors was allowed to die. So where agriculture was underdeveloped, where the population was very poor, where there were, again, workers and peasants were subjected to hyper exploitation and great repression if they tried to resist, and that the national culture of Latvia, the national cultures of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were suppressed and weren't fully developed in this time. And so this period of independence, which the modern so-called nationalists like to draw their inspiration from, was in reality a time in which the free Baltic states were completely subjugated by imperialist forces and were ruled over by these comprador cliques who were happy to act as essentially imperialism's local managers. Is that an accurate way of talking about that interwar period?
It is extremely accurate, and I will provide a lot of references and economic data to back this up. So, right after the capitals, the bourgeois regimes were established in the Baltics, they immediately proceeded to hand over key assets and industrial and farming assets to the foreign capitalist investors. And the governments in the Baltics did a lot of currency manipulation to reduce their own debts. So they depreciated the currency on purpose and to destroy any savings and assets that belong to the people. And in Latvia, the new currency, the Latvian ruble, first it replaced the German Ostmark that was present in the occupied territories. And then they introduced another currency called the Lat. And this currency was several times cheaper than the pre-war currency. So all of the savings that you had, they were basically wiped out. And immediately, all of the trade was focused on Germany and the United Kingdom. And these two countries, these two single countries, they controlled two-thirds of all Latvian imports and exports. Basically, everything went through them. And they could use any sort of trade deal to either punish or reward the Baltic governments depending on their behavior, because they controlled all of the economic leverage. And more than 50% of all banking assets, they were also controlled by the German and British banks. And again, they handsomely rewarded the Baltic nationalist regimes by providing, for example, by providing various assets, by providing stock, so paying the nationalist ringleaders with stock options, and providing lucrative investment deals. But the economy itself, as you mentioned, it was in shambles because, first of all, the existing economic pathways to the east, to Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, they were severed. And it caused the following problem, that Latvia could not easily get all the raw materials that it needed. And at the same time, it had no easy way of exporting its finished goods, because the only land border to the east was with Soviet Russia. And in turn, the Baltics became a logistical dead end. So there was no real purpose to go there unless you, as a capitalist, were willing to exploit the Baltics. So, as you mentioned, all these fast return businesses, they sprung up. For example, the agriculture. These countries were agricultural hubs, and they sold all of the agricultural products to Germany and the United Kingdom. And the latter were already preparing for another imperialist war. And for example, logging and raw materials extraction was also very, very developed in order to sell all of these unfinished materials to these imperialist powers. And the working class and the small peasantry, they also encountered a very heavy taxation burden. The taxes were hiked significantly, and more than 50% of one's income in Latvia, if you were the working class, they were consumed by taxes. And the prices were also very high on finished products. So people couldn't really afford many things. And speaking about the peasantry, this is very important. The one of the reasons why the bourgeois government managed to win is because they exploited the mistakes made by the Soviet government of Latvia. So the Soviet government of Latvia, it did not forge a strong alliance between the working class and the small and middle peasantry, because they immediately nationalized all of the land that belonged to the feudal lords and the capitalists, instead of handing it over to the small peasantry and the middle peasantry to satisfy their demands. And the capitalists immediately exploited this mistake by promising the land to the peasantry. And that is why they managed to attract a pretty significant amount of followers and soldiers who would fight for the capitalists. And after the war ended, the bourgeois government of Latvia did not follow up on their promises. And the so called agrarian reform was not really a reform at all. Yes, they took the land away from the German barons, from the feudal lords, and only left them with very small parcels of land. But most of this land that was acquired from redistribution, it was given to the nationalists, it was given to the capitalists, and it was given to the supporters of capitalism that fought for them or supported them in other ways. But the actual working people, the actual honest peasantry, they were left with nothing. They were given very, very small parcels of land, usually 10 hectares or less, in a very, very poor soils and very poor lands that are not suitable for sustainable farming. And because of that, only around 900 people in Latvia controlled half of all the country's arable land. That was 2.5 million hectares, and the rest belonged to various kulaks that were smaller. So the people were left with nothing, and they owned very tiny parcels of land. And as a consequence, they could not afford machinery. They could not afford fertilizers. They could not work all of the territory themselves. And because of that, they quickly became insolvent. And all of their land, from the bankrupted small peasantry, it was sold for pennies. And the gradual gradual monopolization of land followed. And the nationalist policy was called Danization. So they told everyone, we're going to become the second Denmark. Oh, you see, they have these small parcels of land. They, for example, do a lot of animal husbandry, and their economy is doing okay. But what they didn't tell everyone is that Denmark was already heavily industrialized by comparison. But the Latvian agrarians, the Latvian small peasantry, they could not afford all of this machinery. So the land productivity compared to Denmark was 10 times lower in Latvia. And the capitalists and the investors simply used it as a pretext to monopolize all of this farming. So the same thing happened with the industry. As I told before, the Baltics were really industrialized and had several very large factories. But after the war, these factories were a lot smaller, and the amount of workers was 2 times less in post-war Latvia compared to pre-war, and many more smaller companies sprung up. So in 1913, Latvia had around 15 to 20,000 companies. Most of them were pretty large companies. But after the Civil War, Latvia had more than 100,000 companies, but they were all tiny. They consisted of 10 people or less. And as a result, the economy was really fractured. It was very anarchic. And as a result, the industrial capacity of Latvia, the levels of its industrial production, they never exceeded the pre-war levels. The agriculture, yes, they sort of managed to catch up, but with the industry, no, it did not happen.
So there seems to be a kind of commonality here across the century, which is that the Latvian bourgeois forces, and this is something that they have in common with those in other former Soviet countries, always promise that we're going to be like this model of a wealthy industrialized country in the West. We're going to be like Denmark, or we're going to be like France, or we're going to be like the British, or something like that. But they always lie and misrepresent what these countries in the West are and how they got to be rich and industrialized, and always fail to mention just how ill-suited that model potentially is, and impossible for it is to achieve that in the Baltic states or in other countries that are on lower levels of production, or different levels of production. So it seems that they keep spinning these myths about the West in each period, and of course never actually delivering upon what they promise. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, that is extremely correct, because in order to stay in power, the bourgeois pundits, they have to propagate these myths of the petty bourgeoisie, that everyone gets to be the king, that everyone is going to be rich all of a sudden. And that is why they purposefully destroy all of these large production facilities in order to split and fracture the working class, because large and organized production always creates large, organized, and educated workers. And because of that, they purposely try to retard the economy. They try to stagnate it on purpose. And then they make these impossible promises of getting rich quick. And so they try to expand the number of the supporters of the bourgeoisie and the amount of petty bourgeoisie in the country, both physically by creating all of these smaller enterprises, these smaller anarchistic companies, and also psychologically by purposefully intoxicating your conscience, by trying to bribe your conscience, by trying to convince you to betray your fellow workers in promises of this Faustian deal offered by the imperialists. That's what they managed to do in the 1920s for some time, and that's what they managed to do in the 1990s. Of course, it was different. The tactics were different. The scale was different in the late 1980s, 1990s. But the overall purpose is to fracture the working class, get it more atomized, get it more dependent on the capitalist way of thinking. So that is why we should not disregard all of these teachings that the capitalists have, because they're also discussing ways on how to defeat communism. So, which is why we must pay attention to our enemies' way of thinking, and we must learn from these newer and newer tactics that are designed to keep us fractured, to keep us subjugated, and to prevent the honest working people from seizing power from capitalism. And your summary is absolutely correct about the bourgeois fantasy. Similar thing that happened in Ukraine, for example. Kravchuk in the early 1990s, he promised Ukrainians, should you break away from the USSR, we will be like the second France. And of course, he admitted how France got to be there. And we see the results of this bourgeois policy in Ukraine right now, that it's been nothing short of a complete and utter disaster for the Soviet working people.
Yes, and the commonality, to go right the way back to your introduction, is that the bourgeoisie, whether it is in Latvia, whether it is in Belarus or Ukraine, or like places like Armenia, Azerbaijan, these bourgeoisies prior to the October Revolution, prior to the coming of the USSR, these were stunted and degenerate bourgeoisies, having come late into the world, and they were unable to add anything progressive to these countries. Not really. They were just simply slaves or servants of the imperialist powers. We come forward to the 90s and the 2000s. Really, it's the same thing, but on a new level. The same problem presents itself, which is that neither in Russia itself nor in any of the former Soviet countries is the bourgeoisie capable of taking these societies forward. They're not capable of developing the productive forces. They don't actually want to develop the productive forces, as you've been saying, partly because they do fear an industrial working class. They want, much like the British ruling class want to do, they want to fill the country full of petty bourgeois, which of course is impossible. And they want a country filled with people who only have sort of these petty bourgeois delusions of being the sort of independent small business types. And as a consequence of which, none of these countries go anywhere. Just get sold garbage after garbage after garbage. And that seems to me to be a commonality. A useless and stunted comprador bourgeois existed 100 years ago, and after the counter-revolution in 89 to 91, you end up with roughly the same kind of bourgeois afterwards.
Yes, and what they do, they're trying to exploit the needs and wants of the people, what people really want, both consciously and subconsciously. For example, the need for the self-determination, for example, so that the working people who produce things, who make things work, who produce all of this value to society, that they should decide how things should be going. The need for democratic control of the workplace and the various institutions of authority, that sort of thing. That's what they exploit. And that's why the bourgeoisie tries to hijack all of these progressive, socialist, and even communist slogans. And then what they're trying to do is to claim that they're the ones who represent freedom, and they're trying to pit communism against this really vague and emasculated idea of freedom. Just freedom in of itself, without telling you what kind of freedom it is, and more importantly, for which class this freedom will be given to. That's what they're trying to obscure. That's what they're trying to mask. And that's the thing that was used by the kinds like Solzhenitsyn to try to portray communism as this sort of antithesis of freedom, even though in reality the opposite is true. Only communism is able to give people full self-determination in both external and internal affairs. It is able to give them full freedom. It is able to give them full enjoyment of life, full growth, education, promising and very rewarding work, etc., etc. So that's what the capitalists are trying to hide.
Yes, that's a very good way of putting it. Now, I want to return then to the period of the 1920s. You implied in an earlier answer that the bourgeois regimes in the Baltic states managed to stabilize the situation for a little bit in the 1920s. Now, as we come towards the end of the 1920s, of course, the economic situation in Europe rapidly degenerates to the point of extreme crisis that comes with the crash of 1929. So how does the crash of 1929, which of course has a huge impact across Europe, how does that impact upon the economic life of the Baltic states, and what is the consequence of that crash within Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia?
Yeah, that is a very important turning point because in the mid 1920s, the Latvian and the Baltic bourgeoisie in general, they managed to stabilize things somewhat. And 1929 was, in fact, the most prosperous year for the Latvian interwar economy as a whole. And the repressions continued. And until 1924, the Latvian bourgeoisie carried out military tribunals for the communists. And the first post-war Central Committee of the Communist Party was killed. Either they were shot during these military tribunals, or they were killed by the plainclothes Secret Service agents. For example, comrades Šurfs Jaunzems, Arais Berce, Puriņš Upmalis, they were all killed by the bourgeoisie, despite the bourgeoisie's pledges of democracy, humanity, etc. And people started to realize that it was all lies. The intensity of strikes increased, and by the late 1920s, annually, there were more than 200 strikes in Latvia at any given moment, despite the seemingly successful economic recovery. The Great Depression, yes, it starts in 1929, but Eastern Europe as a whole did not experience the crash until the late 1930, 1931, because there was a severe lag between the Great Depression on Wall Street and the collapse of European capitalism. The Great Depression truly came in full swing by the start of 1931, when the German and Austrian banks collapsed. Then the unemployment rate in the Baltic skyrocketed. In Latvia alone, suddenly there were 50,000 more unemployed people than before. The wages, they immediately plummeted. In some areas, the wages shrank by 1/3, but in many places, the wages contracted by half. Tax burden increased in order for the governments to overcome the fiscal problems, and the import tariffs were immediately raised in order to protect local production. But that also meant that the Baltic economies, which were heavily dependent on import of processed goods and finished goods, the people suffered because they just couldn't afford the things that they could up until recently. And I'm sorry, the government proceeded with even more repression. It started outright banning unions, and it also banned May 1st demonstrations that happened every year in Latvia. So they started dispersing violently all of these strikes, and they creating the ground for fascism to grow on. They started heavily investing in all of these pro-Nazi and fascist parties that sprung up in the late 1920s because they were emboldened by the success of Italian fascism, and the fascist coups in Lithuania and Poland occurred in 1926. So the Latvian fascists felt more and more confident. In 1927, the more progressive social democratic leaning Latvian government signed a very good trade deal with the USSR that provided exclusive transit and trade rights to Latvia. That was very beneficial for the economy, but the reactionaries almost managed to stage a coup over that in 1927. But with the help of the progressive forces and the Communist Party, the coup was thwarted for now. But after the start of the capitalist economic crisis, the fascist onslaught was in full swing. So there were dozens, literally dozens of various fascist organizations. So there were the Nazi groups, the National Alliance, the Patriotic Union, the National Union, the Sentinels organization that was headed by Kārlis Ulmanis, the long-serving prime minister. That was all another fascist group. Yes, there was still some infighting between all these various reactionary groups, but they had a common enemy. The Soviet Union, the communists, that was their enemy, and they were ready to go on the offensive in order to seize full control over the country because the number of strikes increased, the number of insubordinate workers also increased, so they had to act. In 1933, they had another gift. In January, the Hitlerites come to power in Germany, and immediately Germany starts financing all of these groups. So all of these nationalist politicians like Ulmanis, Baluadis, and others, they travel to Germany to receive funding, to receive all of these shares in various German banks as a reward. And in turn, Germany starts financing all of these reactionary groups to take over. And on May 15th, 1934, Ulmanis executes his auto coup. He once again became the prime minister, so he was sort of an on-off prime minister that came into power, then sort of vanished. So he was this behind-the-scenes guy, eminence grise. And in 1934, when he was prime minister, he knew that the socialist-leaning parliament will try to oust him, and they already tried to ban the fascist parties, but the vote was narrowly overturned. And by the end of 1933, 6 communist MPs that were elected into the Latvian parliament, they were formally independent, but they represented the Communist Party. They called themselves the Workers' and Peasants' Bloc. All 6 MPs were immediately arrested. They were handed over to the police, and then on May 15th, 1934, the fascist coup happened. So the parliament was abolished, the constitution was abolished, almost all of these supervisory agencies that could reverse the decision were abolished, and Kārlis Ulmanis and all of his friends got very lucrative government seats, and all of the political parties were banned. And just like in other fascist nations, Ulmanis tried to present his regime as some sort of classless regime or the one that stands above the classes, but it was obvious that he exclusively represented the interests of the imperialist finance capital and the large and wealthy rural bourgeoisie in Latvia. And he immediately began with very harsh and severe crackdowns on all progressive and social movements. And thousands of people were immediately imprisoned and sent to the concentration camps that were newly established. At least 5,000 people were arrested in the first couple of months. And in order to make it look like he was fighting against the Nazi elements, he arrested some of the Nazis, but he immediately released them. Just a couple of months ago. But everyone else was held in prison indefinitely. And the situation with political prisoners in Latvia was so bad that every 2 people out of 1,000 in Latvia, they were political prisoners. So that's how things were. That's how bad things were going. And the government, the fascist government, immediately repealed all of the progressive labor reforms that already existed. So they completely repealed the 8-hour working day, all of the social and economic guarantees to the workers. So people were forced to work for 10 to 12 hours a day with no additional pay. And since all labor unions were outlawed, it was very difficult to file a complaint. It was almost impossible to have your rights met. And if you dared to complain, if you dared to speak about it to other co-workers, you were immediately fired. And because the country was still in the middle of the capitalist crisis, it was very difficult to find a job. In fact, in the winter months, the situation was so bad that many people, they had literally had to work for food, for the kulaks in the countryside, because they just could not find a job anywhere in the city.
Right. So this is extremely reactionary regime, which is ruling largely on behalf of imperialism and is conducting a very harsh internal regime of repression. So there is a huge struggle to come against this, and the class struggles in Latvia ultimately do break out again in a major way. So this fascist regime is ultimately overthrown, isn't it? So can you tell us about how it comes to be that the Latvian fascist regime is overthrown, and what forces it was that were able to actually overthrow it, and how?
Yes, so we'll continue into the mid and late 1930s to explain the context behind the rising communist movement, the movement that finally managed to overthrow fascism. So by the mid 1930s, Latvia, instead of a sharp crisis, it entered the period of wallowing stagnation. So the depression was felt, but in a very long and agonizing way. So it sort of continued. It went on and on. So the wages not only they stagnated, they continued to decrease proportionally because the prices on everything kept increasing. So compared to the sort of prosperous late 1920s, the wages shrank by 50%. So, for example, instead of 4 or 5 lads a day, an average worker earned about 2 lads a day. And the regime started employing a lot of children and women to fill up the gap left by the unemployment. And women and children were paid 2 times less than men. So, for example, if a grown adult earned 2 lads, so children and women earn only 1 lad or sometimes less per day, per full working day. All of these labor norms were abolished, and a lot of the assets, a lot of the uh, bankruptcy assets that resulted from the Great Depression, they were immediately bought up by foreign capitalists. And the situation became so extreme that by the late 1930s, more than two-thirds, 68% of all Latvian banks and their assets were owned by foreign companies. Most often, they were owned by German monopolies. And the external trade it also was very favorable to Germany because Germany began offering these lucrative trade deals in order to prop up the Latvian economy. Because what Hitler wanted to do, he wanted to turn the Baltics into the frontier and staging ground for the eventual invasion of the Soviet Union. So that's why they tried to cater to these Baltic reactionaries, and they tried to completely take over the Baltics economically and then politically because they had all the necessary leverage. And as a reward, Ulmanis and his friends were offered very lucrative positions as members of the German banking stockholders. And the militarization was very, very rapid in the 1930s because the nationalist governments in the Baltics, they willingly threw themselves into the fire because they were hoping that the eventual conquest and takeover of the USSR would grant them with new territories, with new ways to exploit manpower. So that's why they started rapidly militarizing. And for such a tiny country, Latvia, by the end of 1930s, allocated more than 20% of its entire annual budget to military expenditure. But in reality, it was even more because they were spending a lot on police forces, on secret services, and they also supported fascist movements abroad. For example, the fascist government of Latvia was actively supporting the Francoist mutiny in Spain. They actively supported the Spanish fascists and they actively worked against the Spanish Republic. For example, once the Latvian reactionary government sent more than 2,000 tons of ammunition and more than 30 cannons to the Francoist Spain. And they severely repressed anyone who tried to support the Second Spanish Republic. And they charged people with very severe crimes if they tried to go to Spain, if they tried to fight for the Second Spanish Republic. And even despite all of this repression, more than 100 brave Latvians, they went to Spain and they fought for the Second Spanish Republic against fascism. So by 1939, the situation uh, became critical because the imperialist war started. Germany invaded Poland and then the United Kingdom and France declared war on it. So another global conflict sparked up, and Latvia, as a result of the wartime disruption, it lost most of its export avenues. The United Kingdom and Germany, who were not buying anything because they were at war, and the Baltic Sea was not a safe passage anymore for ships. And because of that, the Latvian economy completely imploded. Since it was so export oriented, since it was so dependent on Germany and the United Kingdom, this situation became critical. The unemployment was even worse than at the peak of the Great Depression, and the situation was so bad that Latvia, for most of the 1939 and 1940, had 4 or even 3-day work weeks. So virtually most of the workers, they had to sit and do nothing, and as a result, nobody could earn any money to live. And the Communist Party managed to revive itself in Latvia, and it declared that everybody, all truly progressive, all truly democratic people's forces, need to form a united front. Several independent communist organizations sprung up independently, and they all formed a big and powerful coalition with the Latvian Communist Party proper. And the amount of strikes continued to intensify, and by the late 1930s, there were more than 500 strikes per year, which is very huge. And by 1940, the situation was so critical that the Communist Party and the underground labor unions, they declared a general strike on June 15th. It started in Lithuania. Then the general strike wave took over Latvia, and then it went to Estonia. And before that, in 1939, the Soviet Union proposed a new trade deal in order to rescue the Baltic economies. And the Baltics agreed. So the Soviet Union increased its transit of goods by 10 times, from 14,000 tons to over 150 million tons a year. And the amount of trade that went through the Baltics, it also rapidly increased because the Soviet Union was out of this conflict. And the Soviet Union provided an economic way out for the Baltics to prevent a total economic collapse. And since Germany was already had plans for the Baltic takeover, the Soviet Union signed a military mutual defense treaty with the Baltics, and the Baltics, seeing as they were basically put into a corner by the United Kingdom and Germany, they agreed. And the Soviet forces were stationed in various coastal areas such as Liepaja, Riga, etc. But the Soviet forces were strictly prohibited from doing anything to interfere into the foreign affairs of the Baltics. They had strict orders not to talk to the locals, not to talk to the reporters, and even not to talk to the Communist Party members in the Baltics, in order not to provoke a response from the Baltics and Germany, who were just waiting for any excuse to attack the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union was very vulnerable. And in return, many provocations were actually carried out against the Soviet soldiers in the Baltics, against Soviet diplomats in the Baltics throughout the 1920s and 1930s. And getting back to 1940, the general strike was announced, and many former allies of Ulmanis turned their backs on them because they knew that they could not do anything and that the general strike will win. The striking workers immediately blocked all of the major infrastructure and military outposts. They blocked all major roads. So basically, the fascists could not mobilize. They could not get anything anywhere. And most of these barracks, occupied by paramilitary organizations, they were surrounded, and no one was allowed to get in or out. As a response, Balot is the head chief of staff. He decided to stay neutral. He told Ulmanis that no, he was not going to disperse anyone, that the army would not take any action. And on the contrary, he decided to get into the good graces of the people, and he disarmed all of these fascist paramilitary organizations. So left with no other option, the government tried to appease the workers, but then they received basically it was an order. You could call it an ultimatum, but the Soviet government told the following: if you try to provoke the Soviet soldiers and officers, if you try to disperse the working class in any way, then we will see it as an act of open aggression against the working class and against the Soviet people. And the Soviet government demanded that Ulmanis resign and appoint a new government. Since he proclaimed himself president in 1934 and he was simultaneously the prime minister, he resigned as the prime minister, and he basically told the communists that yes, I agree to your demands, and you can form the new Soviet pro-Soviet government. And the Kirchenstein's government, headed by August Kirchenstein, the famous Latvian biologist, the government was assembled out of various democratic and progressive-minded individuals, and everybody was just shocked that everybody was expecting a bloody repression, just like it happened in 1919. But the fascist regime just collapsed. It collapsed so quickly that even conservatives were completely shocked. They did not expect that. So everybody stayed silent. The reactionaries quietly surrendered. And the new government, it freed all of the political prisoners that were imprisoned after the putsch of 1934. They immediately restored the bourgeois democratic constitution. They immediately proclaimed new special elections in order to elect the new parliament that was dissolved by Ulmanis. And eventually, they simply told Ulmanis that his term as the president was completely illegal because he basically appointed himself as president, and that he needed to step down, which he did because he had no allies at this point, no paramilitary that could bail him out. He didn't have any leverage, so he just surrendered, just like that. So that's how the communists managed to win without bloodshed with this overwhelming popular force. And the new elections were held on July 21st, 24th of 1940, and the people overwhelmingly supported the Working People's Bloc, which received 97% of the vote, because all of the major political forces, the communists, the social democrats, all of these socialist fringe groups, even the liberal groups, they all coalesced together to form this united front against fascism. And they won an overwhelming victory. And since by that time, the Nazis already took over France and the Benelux, the Latvian government realized that they were in great danger from Germany, that the German invasion was imminent. So they sent a delegation, and by the August the 5th, the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union, of the USSR, it approved the Latvian proposal to join the Soviet Union as another constituent republic. And on August 5th, it was finalized. Latvia became the Latvian Soviet Socialist Republic and adopted a new coat of arms, a new flag, a new anthem, and most importantly, it proceeded with the true agrarian and industrial revolution that could finally give the workers the power that they asked for. And it also proceeded to completely destroy the kulaks, the barons, the German barons, the new Latvian barons, the bourgeois barons, and the Latvian and foreign industrialists that ruled over this land. The 8-hour day was immediately re-implemented. The workers' overseeing councils were established at every workplace, and if there were any violations, the workers could immediately file a complaint. All key industries were given to popular control. They were nationalized, and the land was finally distributed to small and middle peasantry. So it was not the fake land reform that happened in the 1920s, but a real reform, that the kulaks were finally ousted and that the peasants could finally work their land without fearing bankruptcy and ruin. And immediately, the Soviet government provided Latvia with a lot of fertilizers and a lot of machinery. So the motor tractor stations were immediately established in the rural parts of Latvia, and the peasants could get interest-free loans to expand their production, to intensify their production, and they could also, again, without interest, could loan out all of this heavy machinery, the tractors, and all of the things that are necessary to work the land, to sow new crops, and that is why the crops, the agriculture was finally recovering, and the industry was recovering. And in just 1 year, between 1940 and 1941, the unemployment was completely eradicated. All of these 50,000 poor people that could not find work, they were finally employed, and finally Latvia could tap into the endless resources and into the endless market of the Soviet Union proper.
So by the end of 1940, on the beginning of the year that would see the launch of the Nazi invasion, you have a situation where where a revolution has broken out in Latvia, and this was also, I think, largely true for the other Baltic states as well, where the workers and peasants have a government that has opted to join the Soviet Union, and the inclusion of Latvia in the planned economy of the USSR is actually overcoming in just a few short months what none of the bourgeois governments of Latvia had been able to address in 2 decades. And so you are seeing huge progress there. Now, of course, none of this is ever talked about by the modern day Latvian compradors or their advocates in Britain or the United States, but this is the real history as to how the Latvia came to join the USSR. It was a popular revolution of the workers and the peasants against a fascist regime, which was destroyed by a workers' uprising. Again, this is history, or are just simply not taught. But what I will do here, comrade, is I will end the recording for today, because I think this is a good point to break on. And the next time we speak, we can cover the war in Latvia and the Baltic states, and then the period afterwards as well, if that's all right with you.
Yes, that is very great, and it's a good way to talk more about the warfare, the resistance against fascism, and of course all the capitalist sabotage and espionage that was happening in Soviet Latvia in 1940 and 1941. Even though the bourgeoisie lost power, lost control of the country, they were not completely defeated, and they still existed. They waited, they gathered their resources, they prepared, because they knew that the imperialist invasion was coming, and they were biding their time. And once again, I would like to thank you for inviting me to this talk. And I also have to remind the people not to forget about Eastern Europe, not to forget about all the oppressed people in Asia, in Gaza, in Palestine, in Africa, in Latin America. And we need all the help that we can get. So I sent some of the account information so that, for example, any of our listeners who would want to help, they could do so. All of the links to literature, which is in English, that the people could read. And of course, you should check us out. We also have a joint YouTube channel with our Russian comrades that is called Dictatura Proletariata. That's on YouTube. We do podcasts there for people who speak Russian, and of course, all of our resources that we have on Reddit, Twitter, Facebook. So you can search up the Baltic SSRs, Iskolat, etc. And I'm certain that you could get in touch with us. So again, thank you very much. And only in joint struggle we can win. So we should never forget about the comrades who are now in prison in Ukraine, in the Baltics, in Russia, and we should we should fight not just for economic well-being of the people, but also for the workers' power, for the psychological. So for the psychological how can I even call it? Just like with the destruction of slavery, with the physical slavery, we must also fight against the enslavement of the workers' minds. We must fight
Yes.
against the never-ending stream of capitalist propaganda, against dehumanization, like they're doing against the people of Palestine, like they're doing against the people of Eastern Europe, like they're doing against the Slavs, like they're doing against the poor migrants and refugees that they're killing in the Mediterranean Sea, like they're doing against the Yemeni people that they're bombed incessantly. This is one struggle, and we must all join and participate in it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's an excellent place to end the episode for today. Join us again for the next part of this, which will be out early next week by this stage. But thank you to Comrade Iskolat for joining me today, and I hope you will enjoy the other part of this when it comes out soon. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and we'll be back with you again later. All right there, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that interview. Certainly, it's spelling out an awful lot of history, which even those of us who have consider ourselves to be a little bit better informed are, of course, unaware of. So we will be returning again with another interview following that one up next week. So be sure to come back for that one. Now, going to draw things to a close for this evening, but we will be back again, this time at 11 a.m. tomorrow morning British time, where we're going to be talking about the apparent permission that has been given by the alleged President of the United States, Joe Biden, for the usage of ATACMS missiles to strike targets inside pre-2014 Russia. There's a lot of bullshit flying around about this, so I'm going to be dealing with that tomorrow morning, 11 a.m. So I'll be back then. Until then, thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Thank you to Iskolat for being such a very interesting and informative guest. I would urge everybody, if you can, to follow him on Twitter or X for more things like that. Follow also some of the links he suggested. So go find the Baltic communist pages on Reddit. You can find those fairly easily. And check out the reading list that I posted up in the Telegram group just yesterday. A lot of very interesting English language sources in there. But until tomorrow, I will bid you good evening and thank you for tuning in. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. And I'll be back with you again tomorrow.